And I was fleeing the state to get away from this man, and I had to call my parents and say, because they had warned me, don't do this. And we live on the side of a mountain. I wound up the driveway, and he was standing in the driveway waiting for me when I got home. And when I got out of the car, he wrapped his arms around me and he said, "Welcome home." No condemnation, no "I told you so," no blame, nothing, just unconditional love. And that grace, Eric, changed my life.
Why did you choose to write a book on the subject of loneliness? How did that present itself to you?
Eric, I have lived most of my adult life alone. And I have had some profound experiences of loneliness. One recently, 6 years ago, when I went in for surgery, and it had to be redone, and the girls dropped me off at the hospital, which was far away from home, and they left me, and I knew I was in good hands, and they knew I was in good hands. But there were complications, and I was by myself. I couldn't reach for a glass of water. I couldn't pull the covers up close to my, over me. So nobody was there, and I felt very much alone. And then, of course, when I went off to boarding school, and Mother and Daddy sent me to New York, and I was
Wait a minute. You went to boarding school in New York? Where?
On Long Island.
Where?
Stony Brook.
You went to the Stony Brook school?
No, I went to Stony Brook Girls' School. I was only of 1 to 6 to ever graduate from that school. But I was so profoundly lonely because that was a school for, I don't want to be harsh, but bad girls from New York. And it was a Christian school in that the faculty were Christians, but the students were not. And I was just lost.
How old were you?
I would have been when I went off first to boarding school, I was 13. Then I was 15 at this time.
Now, this is interesting. A lot of people maybe wouldn't know that your mother came from a missionary background where it would be more commonly accepted to send the kids off to boarding school.
That's right.
Because most folks in America, that's kind of a foreign concept. But why do you suppose your parents chose to send you to this boarding school in far-off New York? Well,
at the time, for the first 2 years, I had gone to school in Florida, and I loved it. But they felt like I was getting a negative attitude. It was a very legalistic school. So they wanted me to be in New York, where Franklin was at the Stony Brook School. So they thought we would be together, and that would be a good thing for us. And they just didn't realize how miserable I was going to be. And after that year, I went on to Gordon College at 16, skipping my senior year in high school. And
are you that smart and you weren't going to tell us?
No, I'm not. That was the only option they felt that they had for me. And so that's what I did. And it was sink or swim. So I did 2 years in one.
You were in Massachusetts as a very, very young woman.
16-year-old girl that had no clue what she wanted to be or do. And fortunately, I had a wonderful roommate who came from a normal family, and they embraced me and included me, and it made all the difference in the world.
It is just interesting. And so that was your first experience, you say, with loneliness. I think many people, of course, have experienced loneliness,
Certainly.
and it's a terrible thing.
Certainly.
But you were a young girl, really. And
I had to learn to rely on the Lord at that point. That's when my faith became my own, not my parents'. I really had to walk with the Lord during that time because I was so lonely and so miserable. But the Lord saw me through it, and I'm very grateful.
It's interesting, of course, how the Lord uses these horrible experiences sometimes to deepen our faith and our reliance on Him. Romans 8:28. Nonetheless, I mean, lots of people then have experienced loneliness, but to write a book about it, what was it that made you say, I've experienced this enough, or this is important enough to me that I actually want to write a book about it? And you've written many books, but why this subject for a book?
Well, so many people are lonely. 54% of Americans feel like no one knows them well. 44%, and this is according to the UCLA loneliness scale, 44% feel that they are alone, that they're lonely. So there are a lot of people that are lonely, but there's a shame attached to it. No one wants to admit that they're lonely. experts have found that it's easier for people to talk about depression than loneliness. And I found that to be true. I remember I was doing research for the book, and I was reading books about loneliness, and I was traveling to a speaking engagement, and I took a book that had loneliness in the title. And I thought, well, I'll read it on the plane. And so I started to take it out of my bag, and I thought, the man sitting next to me is going to think I'm lonely, and I don't want him to think that. So I put it back in my bag because there's a shame to it. We feel like we're deficient, that something's inadequate in us. And so we don't talk about it, and yet we experience it. And loneliness itself can be circumstantial, and you can get over it. There is solitude, which is healthy. We need that to recalibrate and sort of get alone with God and ourselves. And then there's isolation, which in our society is considered the worst form of punishment other than death that we can mete out. So loneliness has lots of components, but loneliness, when it is left unchecked, leads to depression, bad eating habits, suicide. And it's not a USA problem. It's a worldwide problem. When Theresa May was Prime Minister of England, she appointed a minister of loneliness to her cabinet. And Japan suffers an epidemic of lonely deaths where people die and nobody knows until the stench reaches their neighbor's door. So it's a worldwide problem.
That's very depressing, what you just said. My goodness. The idea of loneliness, as you say, what's particularly interesting to me is the idea that if someone is lonely, that they would be somehow ashamed, mm-hmm. that shame would creep into it, mm-hmm. and so it's really, it's kind of how the devil works, isn't it? Mm-hmm. That to be blaming yourself or being ashamed. Nonetheless, really, to write a book on it, I think it's very kind of brave and a big deal that you wrote a book about it, because it is a very important subject. When did you decide to write a book about it? Did something happen that
I don't know that anything happened, but it was sort of the next step in my journey. Most of my books have been about experiences that I've had, and Governor Huckabee asked me one time, he said, "Ruth, what's your next book about?"
Yeah.
And I said, well, actually, all my books have been about experiences, and I don't want any more experiences.
Right.
So, but I really felt that this was a subject that was close to my heart and a necessary subject to be addressed.
All right, we'll be right back. I'm talking to Ruth Graham. The book is Transforming Loneliness. Welcome back. I'm talking to Ruth Graham. The book is Transforming Loneliness, Deepening Our Relationships with God and others when we feel alone. Ruth, it's interesting. Oftentimes, if you present a problem to a Christian, you'll get kind of like a Band-Aid answer, like, well, just turn to the Lord. He's with you or something, which is true. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. But oftentimes, those kinds of answers aren't practical. Mm-hmm. We, I think, sometimes forget that God is a practical God. He made us in His image, and we're supposed to live in this world, mm-hmm. and it's not all this ethereal stuff. So practically speaking, I know you deal with that. What do you say about how to deal with loneliness?
Well, I use an acronym, REACH. Recognize and evaluate your symptoms and sources of loneliness, and then express it to one other and to God, one other trusted person, maybe a pastor, an older person, and tell them that you're lonely. Not too long ago, a young woman came into my office and said, "I'm lonely." And I was so glad that she did, because then we could begin to work on that. And then anticipate that God can transform your loneliness, because He can. And then get into community. You've got to connect with a community, whether it be church, because certainly the decline in church attendance has made loneliness so much worse. Go to a gym class, go to a book club, whatever it is that you need to connect to community, do it. And then honor God with your loneliness. And you just simply say, "God, here it is. I don't like being lonely, but if you would take it and somehow use it in my life for your glory." And He will do that. I remember when the kids were little, we lived in Texas on what some people called a ranch, and we called it a farm, just a little farm. And my husband decided he was going to go hunting on Christmas Day with James Robinson. I was so mad at both of them because this was a family day.
I'm mad at James just thinking about it. James, what's wrong with you hunting on Christmas Day?
I've held it over his head for years.
I know James,
Yes.
so I can joke. But your husband was going to go hunting on Christmas Day.
Yes. And he said he would stay through lunch, so we had the gifts and the stockings and the lunch, and then he waved me goodbye. And I was just furious. I don't think the kids were aware that I was so angry, but I thought, well, I've got half a day left. What do I do? Well, I thought, well, I'll clean up the dishes and I'll pick up the house and eventually put the kids to bed. And I said, well, I've got a long evening. Well, I'd received some presents, and I thought, well, I'll write thank you notes and get that off my list. So I wrote thank you notes, and I still had an evening left. And
Christmas Day.
Christmas Day.
I'm mad just thinking about this. Wait till I see James Robinson again. I'm going to bring this up. Is this many, many years ago?
Many. The kids were little.
Okay.
And then I thought, well, I have a piano in the living room. I can find middle C. But I thought, well, I can plunk out some Christmas carols. And so I plunked out some Christmas carols, and I came to the carol.
I'm going to cry. You're alone on Christmas Day,
evening.
playing Christmas carols. It's almost like it makes it worse.
Actually, I sat there and I was worshiping the Lord.
Oh, that's different.
And that transformed my loneliness and my anger. And if you were to ask me today what was my happiest Christmas memory, that would be it. Because I really met the Lord. The Lord met me in my loneliness.
Wow.
Mm-hmm.
I want to know, what were they hunting that took them away from their families on that
You'll
day?
have to ask James.
Hunting for birds? Wait till I talk to James and Betty. That's beautiful. That really is beautiful. But it's interesting because you've just shared something. Almost everyone has experienced something very similar to what you've just shared. And by your sharing it, you make me feel less strange or alone because I realize I'm not the only one that's had that experience. Mm-hmm. And it's that more painful if it's the people that you love, mm-hmm. because you lean on them the most. So if they step away for good reasons or ill, it hurts the most. So that's an amazing... Do you write about that in the book?
Yes, I do. Mm-hmm.
You mentioned James by name?
I don't know if I mentioned James or not.
We know who you are. We know where you live.
I have told him over and over again.
That's amazing. I still want to know what they were hunting on Christmas Day. So the acronym, this is chapter 9. The acronym is REACH, REACH. Obviously, people can read about it in the book. But tell me again what those letters stand for.
R is to recognize your sources and symptoms of loneliness. E is to express it to God and to one other person, one other trusted person. A, anticipate that God will transform your loneliness. C is connect with a community, because God is in community and we were built for community. It's in our DNA. And then H, honor God with your loneliness.
And how does one do that? I want to talk about community, but to honor God, what do you mean by that?
Well, you simply give it to Him. And like I just told you the story of just worshiping Him, and just saying, okay, God, I'm lonely. I could make this a whole lot worse and be just angry and stew in my anger, or I could just give it to you and see what you do with it. And He made it a happy Christmas for me.
It's just so beautiful. When you talk about community, obviously the C in REACH, that's a big one, that there are people who, for some reason, aren't involved in a church. I would say it to almost anybody, like, you should just go find a church, find a place that you can be a part of that community. There's just something healthy about that. But a lot of times maybe people don't, or they fear rejection maybe. Is that what it is? They feel that they're going to show up and nobody's going to greet them? But
don't we all feel that way? If we feel like we're a stranger. If we we just hesitate. I remember when I was first divorced and I was on the board of a school and I had to go to an event by myself. And I really had to just sort of grit my teeth and go. Just make yourself go. And, you'll get yourself a glass of club soda with some lime in it, and you try to mingle along. And I just hated every minute of it. But you do it. And the first time is the hardest. But then gradually you sort of begin to do it. And like I said, I've been alone most of my adult life. So I've had to do things by myself. And I like myself. I like my company. And I like my cat. A pet helps too.
A pet, yeah. Well, that's, you talk about practicality.
Mm-hmm.
There's no doubt about that.
Mm-hmm.
There is just no doubt about that,
Mm-hmm.
that pets help loneliness. Now, to be clear, I didn't say this. You live in Virginia. You have 3 grown children, and it says 9 terrific grandchildren.
Yes.
Any rotten kids that
No,
you're not mentioning
no,
here?
no.
They're all terrific?
They're all terrific. All of them, their individuality, they're just, they're all different. One of them has tattoos from head to his toe, and he's just
Was he born that way?
No, he wasn't born.
Oh, this was a choice.
And but he's brilliant. And actually, he's coming up this afternoon, hopefully, to have dinner with us. He lives in Philadelphia. And then the rest of them are, working their way through life. I have a granddaughter who was hit head on by a tractor trailer, and she's trying to recover from that. It's been a long go, but she's an EMT, and she's determined to be a fireman. I don't know whether she's going to be able to do that or not, but she's determined.
Wow.
And the rest of them are plugging through school.
9 terrific. Whenever anybody says, most bios say something like that, 3 terrific kids, and I'm like, and just 3? Like, is there one you're not mentioning? No, 3 grown children, 9 terrific grandchildren. You said before that you were in a conversation with Governor Huckabee about, he was asking you about your next book, and you talked about how you write about your experiences, and you've been beautifully transparent about your life and your experiences over the years. And that's just so valuable and so rare. I mean, even writing about this, people need that, because I think a lot of people would assume, like, oh, it's Billy Graham's daughter. She must have, great life. And you're just like everyone else. Mm-hmm. There's ups and downs and stuff, but you have been public about that and honest about that. What other experiences, when you mentioned that you've written all these books, I mean, I know you've written 10 books, but what other experiences have you touched on in your books? Well,
I did In Every Pew Sits a Broken Heart, which really, for me, I was the person in the pew with a broken heart. And I was not allowed to have a broken heart. I was going through a divorce, and at that time, you just didn't do that, especially in the Christian church. And I was told that if I divorced my husband, who had been unfaithful for years, that I would hurt thousands of people. Well, I was told to add another bedroom to the house and just live with it. But I couldn't do that. That wasn't honest. And I said, I can't do that. Well, that created a whole nother mess.
There were people saying to you that's not grounds for divorce? I mean, it's not clear to me what the objection would be.
They just thought I should forgive.
Well, we always should forgive, but that's a separate issue.
Absolutely, but I didn't know that at the time. I have come to understand.
They didn't know that.
They didn't know that, and I didn't either. Because reconciliation is conditioned on the changed behavior, and forgiveness is unconditional. And I could forgive him, but I just couldn't reconcile. He had broken my trust and my heart, and I did not see the changed behavior that was necessary for me. And so I did divorce him, and that created a whole spiral of negative things that I ended up with a rebound marriage that lasted for 3 months, and I became afraid of that man and fled, and he divorced me. But Eric, my father was gone when I was a little girl, a lot. And as a little girl, I wanted a daddy to tuck me in bed. I wanted him to teach me to ride a bicycle. And when I needed him the most, he was the farthest away. And I would have told you that Jesus was my security, but he really wasn't deep down inside where the secrets are kept. And so I was looking for security. So I married the second man, and that ended in divorce. And then I married a third man who was the love of my life. He was my best friend. We had a wonderful time together until we didn't. And he decided he didn't want to be married anymore. And he divorced me. And I thought, okay, that's good. I'm settled. That's it. But then a man who was a counselor and a pastor and who had helped my daughter through her bulimia, and he knew all the right buttons to push. And I fell madly in love with him and married him. And turns out he was a narcissistic sociopath. And he was in a car accident. And when I was helping him recover from that, he had spent me into $100,000 worth of debt. And I said, I have to move into a smaller house in a cheaper community. And he wouldn't do that. And so when I finally said, because the house was mine, I said, I'm going to have to sell the house. And he said, then I'm going to divorce you. And he did.
Oh, my goodness.
So 4 divorces, and I thought, what is wrong with me? Was I even saved? And I write about this extensively in my book, Forgiving My Father, Forgiving Myself, because
when did that come out?
That came out 2 years before this one. And
so recently.
And I didn't know what to do with myself, but a friend of mine, I was having a conversation with him in Nashville, and he said, Ruth, you felt abandoned as a little girl. And I thought, I had been through thousands of dollars worth of therapy, and nobody had ever said that to me. And I denied it. But immediately I knew that piece fit the puzzle. And I have never had a problem with it since. I've been cured.
But that's extraordinary to hear your story. I was not really aware of the painful drama that you just laid out of your life, that you have suffered. And a lot of people suffer, but to, in some sense, be a public figure because of who your father is, it makes it the more difficult, it would seem to me. So it's all the more extraordinary to me that you would write about it for all those others out there who are dealing with very similar things.
Well, I share it because when I make myself vulnerable, that gives people permission to make themselves vulnerable. And that's when ministry really takes place. And so right now, the Lord has called me into prison ministry, and to be able to teach these books, loneliness. Actually, prisoners contributed to my loneliness book, and to teach them the forgiveness book via Zoom in Mississippi and West Virginia, and to see the lights go on, that they could forgive themselves. That is such a blessing to me. And had I not shared those things, those prisoners would never have related to me in any way. And I'm very grateful for that opportunity.
Well, again, it's so beautiful to me that you have bravely been willing to be transparent about this, because, again, you don't hear it said very often, but people suffer, people struggle. Most people do.
Christian people do.
And Christian people do. And Christian people with the ultimate Christian pedigree of being, the daughter of Billy Graham do. We do. Your father was your hero.
Yes. And I don't in no way blame him. I made my own choices. My father loved me unconditionally, and I knew that without a shadow of a doubt. And the best illustration I could possibly give was the one I gave at his funeral, where I had this rebound marriage. My parents had warned me against it, and I was fleeing the state to get away from this man, and I had to call my parents and say, because they had warned me, don't do this. And we live on the side of a mountain. I wound up the driveway, and he was standing in the driveway waiting for me when I got home. And when I got out of the car, he wrapped his arms around me and he said, "Welcome home." No condemnation, no "I told you so," no blame, nothing, just unconditional love. And that grace, Eric, changed my life.
Well, that's extraordinary.
He showed me what God the Father was like that day.
Yeah, that's kind of a big deal. Kind of a big deal. It's interesting because a lot of people who are doing good things and great things, even for the Lord, like your father, that there can be a downside. The fact that he was away so much, so many people's lives were touched, and yet you can't do that and be home to tuck in your kids.
That's right.
And that was also somewhat of a different era where fathers were often absent. And so that bears that has effects.
Of course it does. And he said that in his memoir.
Yeah.
You know, he said, I know that my absences had repercussions in my children's lives. And it certainly did in my life.